I want to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Peace and Justice Education and the Augustinian Chair to this colloquium that'll be primarily Joshua Dubler giving you some sense of the work he does. And after he talks a bit, I'll say a little bit about my experience of teaching philosophy, but not at Graterford, but not too much, because Joshua and I are both anxious to have a conversation about the implications for teaching coming from the challenge of teaching in the environment of an SCI. I'm not going to say much about Joshua. I think fairly highly of him, but I'll just sort of let that come out in his interaction with you. His PhD is from Princeton. He taught a while at Haverford. He was in the Society of Fellows at Columbia. I think most importantly for us, he was a participant in the Villanova Graterford program. And I will mention, to give you some context, the courses that he taught there: event history, ethnography in the spring of 2011, Freud, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky in fall of 2009, and religion and tradition of social theory in spring of 2007. He also, for his dissertation work at Princeton, spent some extended time in the chapel there, observing and studying the religious life. That has since come out in a really marvelous book called Down in the Chapel, Religious Life in an American Prison. And I think it'll give you some sense of what went into this book. But I would encourage all of you to check it out when you get a chance. And actually, I want to make this book available to the class I'm teaching at Graterford this semester with Ron Hill. What Joshua and I thought we would do is I asked him to, say some things, maybe 20, 30 minutes. It can be less, more, depending on him. So you get some sense of the work that he's done in Graterford and the kind of questions that he has about teaching philosophy and theology and theology and religious studies at Graterford. And then, as I said, I will just add a bit of reflection of my own experience after he's done, and then we'll open it up for conversation and comments and questions. So, good to see you. Glad you're here, and welcome.
Thank you, Jim, for inviting me down, and thank you to the center for sponsoring this, and thank you to all of you for coming out. I think I'm just basically going to cover the same terrain that Jim just covered from my perspective to give you an idea of how it is that I come to sit before you today with some of the commitments and questions that I have. And I also I come to you with a set of with an interest and a commitment to prison teaching, but little beyond that. I don't have a philosophy of it or a fixed notion of what the pedagogy ought to be, and I'm not even certain as to why I think it's something that I'll do in some form, or something that I aspire to do in some form for the rest of my life. But those are some of the questions that I think it would be great for us to begin talking about today. So to start somewhere near the end, I collaborate with a philosopher named Vincent Lloyd at Syracuse, and he is a serial beater of the bushes and brings a great deal of things our way. So we applied for a grant from the AAR to run a one-day workshop in Montreal this May called something like Teaching Religious Studies Behind Prison Walls, to try to bring together people around the country who are doing this kind of work. We are in, I think, an era of, we're entering a new heyday of prison college programs. It's a new heyday that I'm excited to be a part of it. I hope that some of you are already a part of it. Maybe others of you will want to become a part of it. It is it's the heyday of college programs in prison, the neoliberal reboot So in the earlier incarnation between the 70s and the 80s, when there were a lot of college programs in prison, a lot of that was funded by Pell Grants, and the state was really kind of on the hook in terms of the cost. It seems as if in the new era, with the Barred Prison Initiative being the kind of really the most public, and in some ways like the early adopters or the trendsetters in this regard, you have private institutions with foundation money who are running these programs, but not so much in Pennsylvania, but in Jersey and New York and elsewhere, there's suddenly there are beginning to be a great deal of opportunities for incarcerated men and women to get degrees in higher education. So we wanted to bring together folks who are doing this to begin a conversation, both so as to figure out how we should teach when we're in these environments, how to deal with your own administration and with the administration of correctional institutions. And then also, I think, in some ways, separate from that, or just to kind of build strength within our community, to try to mobilize, to activate and potentially radicalize people where we are to work toward ending this thing, mass incarceration. I'm not exactly certain what the relationship of the prison teaching is to that other political project. That's something that maybe we could consider. It doesn't seem like an obvious thing to me that teaching in prisons is necessarily going to contribute to the end of mass incarceration, but I hope that it is. So, returning to the beginning, I got my doctorate at Princeton, and my subfield was religion in America, but I worked a lot with the philosopher Jeffrey Stout, and I have leanings in that direction. And I wanted to do an ethnography about religion in prison, and Graterford was willing to let me in. Graterford is not what it once was, with what it once was being before 1995. When 1995, there was this event that people still talk about, whether they're administrators or guards or prisoners. They talk about this event called the Raid. The Raid was right when Tom Ridge came into office. He and his deputy of corrections, who's now in California, whose name unbelievably I can't remember right now, they came in with the ambition to kind of radically reshape the culture at Graterford. Graterford was an exceedingly porous institution. Pennsylvania's institutions compared to the states around here are already rather porous to a large degree because of the Pennsylvania Prison Society that in some sense wrote up the charter of the Commonwealth's, what used to be the Bureau of Corrections and is now the Department of Corrections. You have a lot of people coming in and out of the prison, official visitors, but then Graterford had a ton of volunteers coming in to doing all sorts of programming, and there was a lot of trade of contraband. There remains trade of contraband, but in any case, by 1995, Graterford was wildly out of step with the times, and under Ridge, they established what was kind of they dragged Graterford belatedly into the kind of contemporary culture of control, and that was both belated and only partial. Graterford's culture is again going to be revolutionized next year or so when they shut down this institution. At least they claim they're going to shut it down and move all of its inhabitants to a new facility that they've built at the cost of $400 million over the past few years. I researched this book. Maybe none of you have been down to the chapel ever at Graterford, even though those of you who've been in the school. It's a wildly interesting place if you study religion, if you study American religion. There are 12 or 13 officially recognized groups that over the course of any given week convene something like 50 worship services, Bible studies, and musical group rehearsals. So I spent a year and a half hanging out there. I started at these sites of public worship and I gradually started spending a lot more time in the offices where something like 15 men, incarcerated men, work for between 19 and 41 cents an hour as janitors and clerks, along with 5 full-time chaplains, or 4 full-time chaplains, 1 half-time chaplain, and 2 correctional officers. And the book really came out of that experience and foregrounds that experience, actually, of doing field work. It takes place over the course of 1 week in January 2006, in which that set of formal activities, it provides the kind of structure, the skeleton of the book, and the men who work in the chapel are the book's heart and soul. These are the central characters. They are, of the incarcerated men, they are, with a couple exceptions, are serving the sentence of life without the possibility of parole. As you may know, Pennsylvania is a state where life is life, and whereas before Ridge, there used to be a robust commutation system in Pennsylvania, so that if you got sent to life, you might reasonably expect to serve on average 17, 18 years. Ridge changed the rules administratively, and since then, maybe 1 or 2 people have gotten commutation. So the central characters in the book have been at Graterford since the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, and in the case of, I'd say, the central character of the book, a mutual friend of ours, Charles Coley, has been in prison longer than I've been alive. So the book is, I won't say much about the book, only that it's not a book that lends itself well to like job talks. It doesn't have a, it refuses the idea that that I'm in a position, that if there is such a thing as religion, we need to talk about what we mean by that. If there is such a thing as the prisoner or prison culture, well, that reveals as much about us and how we configure that as an object as it reveals about them. And certainly, if there's someone to tell you the story about what religion in prison is about, that person is not me. There are lots of characters in the book who will tell you what religion in prison is about, and I kind of curate their responses and act as an interlocutor and kind of push back to their responses. But the book is also not just a study of them in a way that I hope is not narcissistic or self-regarding. It's a book about me, and it's a book about me as a secular Jew who doesn't necessarily know what the good is, but is trying to figure it out and trying to figure out what the good life entails. And it's me as a citizen of this society where we incarcerate so many of our fellow citizens for so long, and trying to figure out what that necessarily entails. But maybe for me, my favorite part of the book is on Friday night, where I'm meeting with the Jews, and for me it feels different than the rest of the week because of something that has to do with being a part of a people or something. And the most, do you know Gary? He's not in the program. He's a very bombastic, litigious Jew, both out of his kind of out of the rabbinic practices he engages in, but more out of being a kind of an incarcerated intellectual who is a serial engager in the practices of litigation. And he's interrogating me on Friday night as to, like, there are other guests there who are there, and tell them about what your dissertation's about. Tell them what you're doing. And I say, no, I don't want to. Tell them. What is religion here? What is it? What is religion is a category with a history. We need to deconstruct it. Tell them, is our religion, is our faith here real? Is there real faith here? And of course I thwart this. I try to answer this question, but I only know how to answer this kind of question in a way that can only frustrate Gary, who's called Brian in the book. And I give him this set of possibilities, or I give the reader a set of possibilities. And he hates what I say, and he says, "Come on, what do you think religion is?" And I say, "Not merely out of a lack of conviction or so as to rile Brian am I reluctant to characterize religion too neatly. As I see it, rather than in the discreetly mapped forest, it is in the territorial mess of trees and shrubs, undergrowth and earth where the stuff of religion takes place. And if religion might be cleanly designated in theory, in practice it is a messy glut of particulars, with overarching conceptualization being just one of these many burls. As I fear, any attempt to sum up what religion at Graterford is about would necessitate sacrificing the unruly breadth and depth of the chapel's religious practices for the overdetermined subset of elements that lend themselves to expedient summation. Quite simply, the world as it unfolds in time is far more extravagant and intricate than scholarly argument can possibly allow. If not theological per se, the devotion to describe this reality justly is arguably as close as I get. And so there's a kind of refusal of standard scholarly methods of argumentation out of something like an ethical or aesthetic commitment to describing things. It's very quixotic. And there's also a refusal to say what religion in prison is about, because the categories that we come to that with, especially with the ways that we think about prisoners as define them by virtue of their crime, and the assumptions we make about their surplus or their lack of sincerity, consequently, is, I feel as though if I simply had an argument, it would only manage to reinscribe that kind of unthought conceptual infrastructure. So anyway, so that's the book. It's a very quixotic thing. Give me 5 more minutes. 5 minutes?
As much as you want.
Toward the end of researching the book, a bunch of folks, you might imagine, so of the 3,500 men who are incarcerated long-term at Graterford, there's another 500 or so men who are there for parole violations or who are just moving through on their way to Harrisburg. A quarter of them are serving life, and of that quarter is disproportionately involved in the various kinds of, in the rich tapestry, again, not as rich and thick as it once was, but the rich tapestry of different kind of educational, therapeutic, social, civil society organizations. If you're, I think that, at least if you listen to the older people, if you're there serving 5 to 10 years, it's, even 10 years, you can proceed as if this isn't your life. But the men who are there and who know at some level they're going to die there, they make their lives there, and so they're involved in a lot of different things. So a lot of the men that are involved in the chapel are also kind of hold down the Graterford program and love the Graterford program, and the Villanova program, excuse me, and have become the people who they are by participating in that program. And so a lot of them were saying, hey, you should teach in this program. And especially Mahmoud, Reginald Roan, he was pretty, but also Mabdi, Charles Coley. Anyway, so I started to. I was teaching in Haverford at the time, and so I taught this class in the spring of 2007, Religion and the Tradition of Social Theory. I assigned fewer pages than I would assign out on the street, as the men in there would say. It was a kind of, Eliade, Durkheim, Levi-Strauss, Geertz, Marx. What's that?
You're so Princeton.
I'm so Princeton, but into at the end a kind of like Marx, Foucault, Taussig, Cornell West. I guess I was trying to suggest something that I was a little more Marxist than Princeton, but finishing with Cornell West doesn't really establish that, now does it? I didn't know. I was teaching for the first time at Haverford, so in some ways I was a better teacher then than I am now. In other ways, I had no idea what I was doing. I knew, having been an ethnographer and having known a lot of these men, I had the advantage of stepping into the classroom in a way that it wasn't just me stepping in with like a bunch of prisoners where they would be the kind of projection of whatever I would have brought into the room, what I imagined about prisonerness. These were men that were already my friends and in many ways my instructors. That was a significant advantage. And they were also, I knew who to go to so they could instruct me about how not to screw it up. And so, for example, I don't know what the culture is like here. Maybe undergraduates maybe cover your ears, but I was quickly, by people like Mabdi and by Stan Rosenthal, grade inflation was not going to fly there. That was one thing. That if everybody was getting A's, that was going to piss off the people who were doing really hard work. And so I don't believe in grades, but I believe in I believe in, like, you know, to speak the language of the community you're speaking with in order to be heard. And so I ended up, just one way that teaching in prison was different is that I used the whole spectrum you know, I gave C's on papers and stuff because that's what was expected of me. I knew going in that that one way that I was going to screw up that experience was that if I was still there as an ethnographer. So my instincts in the classroom already lean toward, and I have a former student here who can tell you if this is true or not, but I'm a somewhat anal retentive textualist. It makes me nervous if we're having a good time, but we're not talking about the text, because then we might just have a good time all semester and never talk about the text, and then the texts might never get read, and then the world might spin off its axis. Or I can't follow it all the way down of why that's important that we all do the reading. But I came in as a kind of rigid textualist. We need to understand these arguments, and the impulse of students that you have everywhere to kind of, but especially in certain kinds of subcultures, to flee the text for their own experience. That was something that I was very intolerant of. In that way, I guess I'm positioned already within a kind of debate. I'm not well versed in the debates of teaching in prisons and the kinds of pedagogical issues. But if I could lay them out a little bit, if trying to make sense of what people think we ought to be doing when we're teaching in prisons, there is this kind of radical teaching camp, and this would be exemplified. The program at Cornell is motivated by this. Maybe in some ways Inside Out comes out of this framework, but the radical teaching seeks to empower students to disrupt traditional kinds of hierarchies between teacher and student, and empower students and bring into a kind of like epistemological pluralism that would recognize a variety of different ways of knowing. So that's the kind of more radical approach, and you can see the kind of political aspiration that comes out of that approach, that recognizes in our kind of entrenched hierarchies certain kinds of modes of social injustice that maybe it's trying to shatter from the ground up. The other approach, which is the philosophy behind the Barred Prison Initiative, which is both all over the state of New York, and in some way is the template for a lot of other kinds of liberal arts schools that are getting into teaching in prisons. What they talk about is, they call it concept critique, and it's slightly more disciplinary, and it owns the idea, the idea that, like, as instructors who are trained in this, that we have a kind of a method or a set of techniques that we have to share with our students, and that's what we're there to teach, and we're not necessarily there to foreground their experience, either as students or as prisoners. But, in as much as, say, as a culture, we might think of the problem of crime as simply the problem of individual bad actors making bad choices, by having thicker descriptions and kind of richer analytic frameworks for thinking about individual action, for example, we might come by frameworks analytic frameworks that might lend themselves to doing justice better as a society. Anyway, those are two different frameworks. I only read that material this fall when I was trying to put together a supplementary grant application to Wabash for this thing we're doing in Montreal. So I don't exactly know where I stand in it. But yeah, I taught these 3 classes. The first class was the religion class. The second class was the kind of stuff that I didn't manage to put into the religion class. The class on Freud, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky. There's nothing I enjoy reading more than Freud and Nietzsche. I felt like I needed someone who gave religion something more of a fair shake. A lot of the men who participate in this program are men who have deep kind of religious commitments, mostly Christian and Muslim, but not exclusively. And so I needed someone from the same kind of milieu, but who was more kind of friendly to faith. And so I ended up with Dostoevsky, and then Brothers K is too long, and so I ended up doing Crime and Punishment, and that felt really corny and presumptuous and weird, right? At the same time, obvious and irresistible, so I don't know. So I did that, and then the final class, which in some way, and again, I don't know what I was doing differently than I would have done on the street. One thing I knew that I do differently was it's only a once-a-week class. They don't have access to the internet, so they're weekly papers. I'd have them write weekly papers, and then I would start each class by going back to their papers, right? And so class was divided between what we did last week and what we did next week. It's something that you would never do in a class out here, right? If you have kids do papers on Blackboard, there's no reason you can't read their papers in advance of class. Anyway, it's just one way that it was different. The final class that I taught was, for me, amazing. I think my students were a little underwhelmed, but it was this class, event history ethnography, and the idea was to look at texts that are structured around particular events. So we started out by reading some theory. We read some Badiou, for whom the event is the kind of cornerstone of one's ethics, one lives in the world in fidelity to an event, according to Badiou. We read Hayden White, who's a kind of philosopher of narrative and thinking about the ways that ideologies inform the way we read events, and then the way we talk about events, figure our way of being in the world. And then we started reading some stuff like Richard Kapuscinski's books on the Iranian Revolution, and then the Arab Spring happened, and Occupy was happening. No, Occupy was still a year away. The Arab Spring happened, and so I threw out the syllabus, and for a bunch of weeks I just was compulsively reading the internet and bringing them essentially the pre-processed reel of the Arab Spring, and we were trying to read it and understand what was going on, and that got everybody excited about the question, why not here, if not here? And so then we spent the rest of the semester reading about revolutions, and we read The Black Jacobins by James, and we read a bunch of stuff. And then I had them do their own kinds of ethnographic historical projects, and some of them were about world historic events, and some of them were about events in the prison, and the results were uneven. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Getting to have taught, I don't know how many of you, I'll find out how many of you all have taught in the Villanova program at Graterford. So it's among the most, I can't fully disaggregate it in my mind and in my soul from the experience of doing the field work in the chapel, but I've never had such an amazing teaching experience, and the kinds of relationships that you forge with men under those circumstances are amazing. Yeah, and I hope to teach in prisons for as long as I live. I don't exactly know why. I don't know what it's necessarily. My intuition is that it's good. I certainly think it's good for those of us in this room to build bridges, to connect to this otherwise invisible population, if indeed you are from a community where prison populations can be placed out of sight, out of mind, rather than the missing people are felt in your everyday life. So it's clearly good for my soul. I don't know why. I'm curious to know why those of you who do it, what we're doing it for, how, if at all, it relates to some kind of political project, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I just wanted to make one comment about his book that I think is one of the most intriguing features, and I think it was very difficult to convey, is how much Josh puts into question his own philosophical religious sensibility. Basically a religion of a pluralist, open, kind of secular Jewish intellectualism, that he does not spare himself his own skepticism. In some ways you were more compassionate to the guys than you were to yourself in the book, but it raises some really, I think, profound questions, as prison teaching does, about what goes on in any classroom. Now, I'm going to keep my remarks to about 5 minutes because I really want to get into our conversation. And what I really want to do is kind of frame a question that I have no idea how to answer, but I'm hoping that maybe together we can get somewhere on it if it's a question you find compelling. I started teaching in the Graterford program in the spring of 2007, and I owe my participation really to a great mentor of the program, Joe Betts. We had, as philosophers often do, a hallway conversation where Joe basically mentioned the program and asked me if I'd had any interest in teaching in a maximum security prison. And because I'm a deeply reflective person who always weighs the pros and cons, I said, sure. I'm not sure, honestly, what my motives were for wanting to be involved, other than the fact I knew that I wouldn't know what I was doing in that environment. And perversely, I think that was a draw for me. I do remember the orientation session, 3 hours at Graterford before I would be admitted as a volunteer subcontractor, or however they were categorizing me. It was sort of the opposite of a therapy session. A therapy session is designed to relieve anxiety. This session was designed to invoke it. So I left that session with 2 takeaways. One, I was going to be deceived often and systematically. And 2, there was no way I was going to avoid being on the wrong side of somebody's rules. That shook me up for a while until I realized, hey, I have the Augustinian chair. This is just the doctrine of original sin. This is just no different from any kind of other kind of environment. So I said the first course I taught there was ethics, and the only assumption I brought into it was this, naive or not. If you were at the point in your life where after probably several decades of life in a maximum security prison, you had the presence of mind and soul to be within a college level course, you've probably done some significant work on yourself. So I wasn't going to venture an ethics course where the approach to the material didn't in some way represent significant work on oneself from the writer's point of view. So I ended up organizing the course around 2 texts, and I had actually the same problem with contrivance you had with Dostoevsky. I used Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius, philosopher who died 525, 6th century, in a political. He got on the. He basically got in between 2 agents in a power struggle, and realpolitik triumphed over his idealism. He was jailed, tortured, and died, and he wrote the Consolation of Philosophy while in prison. And the other text I used as a centerpiece was James Baldwin, If Beale Street Can Talk, which is also about basically it's set up as a love story that then gets broken apart, and the male character ends up in prison, and you have a similar kind of ethics of transformation. I mean, honestly, what I wanted to understand was something of the problem, understand the way in which the body and the body politic become prison houses for the soul. And being in a physical prison and living there sets a context for what actually I certainly was surprised about in reading Boethius. My experience with the men in Graterford only was deepened in this direction. The confidence in the soul, which allows the thought that even though you're in an external prison and it's real and it's often being set up for conditions that are less than just, out of conditions that are less than just, you nevertheless have the presence of mind to wonder about your own internal prison and be willing to take a good look at that and to dismantle it. I think for me, one gift of teaching there was after doing it, really after the first time, but after having done it now for about 8 years, I'm actually quite convinced that the languages of philosophy and religious studies are great cultural resources, and they really allow for the articulation of voice to carry across circumstance and limitation. In many ways, I think teaching Greater Furt has given me a window into the crisis of the humanities. So-called, what our culture calls unproductive individuals, actually turn out to be in an extraordinary position to advance a language of soulcraft. But here's where my question comes in. I'm teaching, I've gone back to Boethius in the context of a very different course that I'm teaching with Ron Hill, called The Philosophy of the Social Venture, which Joshua Nunziato, among others, helped put together the syllabus. I find myself really haunted by the figure of Boethius the prisoner. This is the former professor who came to the understanding that there was something arrogant and self-defeating about thinking you could use your intellectual gifts to make another person good. And yet there must be something about the participation in the philosophical life and the life of faith, which for Boethius really came to be the same life, that allowed some kind of illumination in the middle of the consolation, where he basically has convinced his prison self that the world is not just a chaotic mess out to exacerbate sorrow and suffering, but in fact is a providential order, but he doesn't simply allow himself that thought. He retells the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and I won't go into a great explication of that, just to give you the rough details. Orpheus is a great mythic poet, a rival of Apollo himself, so a poet capable of extraordinary inspiration. Eurydice, her name means wide-ranging justice, and actually for Boethius, that's an important detail. And in the myth, Orpheus loses Eurydice to a snake bite, and she's in the underworld, leaving him to languish above, and he's brokenhearted, and he uses his power of inspiration to breach the defenses of the underworld and to rescue Eurydice, which is a violation of laws above and below. You're not supposed to cross this wall any more than you're supposed to cross the wall between the prison and the outside world. This is supposed to be an absolute wall. But he gets a pass. He can go into the underworld, which for Boethius is a prison. Right? It's the psychic image of the prison that he finds himself in. And he wants to reclaim Eurydice. Fine. As long as on the way out, she follows him of her own volition, and he doesn't look back. Well, he gets nearly to the top, and for every reason, and Boethius doesn't say why he thinks this happened, he turns around to grab Eurydice and loses her again to the underworld. So that's the mythic image. Here's the question that keeps me up these days. I no longer am comfortable simply going into Greater Furt, teaching a course, and coming back. Although ultimately I know very little, the little I know is too much. I very much am aware I'm teaching in an environment where injustice is manifest. I think I've styled myself as a kind of Orphic philosopher. You know, keep your eye on the illumination, the inspiration, and justice will follow on the way out. I have a lot of sympathy with the Orpheus who turns around and tries to grab justice and pull it out. Now, I'm not naive in the sense that I think that we live outside of a prison in a just society. It's just in your face when you're in the prison. My question really is how, and this goes back to actually I think where Josh started off. What is it are we called to do in this environment? You know, I mean, you go in there and you're like, you know, would you like to see mass incarceration? And, well, you don't have to teach very long in a prison system for that answer to be, yes, of course. But what's the relationship between working for justice, actually to change or transfigure institutions so that they mediate different kinds of possibilities, and the sort of things we are normally given to do as professors. I think both things are important. How they relate, I don't know. To me, it's a much broader question. It's a question that Villanova very much takes on, of the question between service and the life of the mind. Graterford very much underscores that question, and I don't have an answer. But I will leave it at that. Please, the floor is open for comments and questions.
I'm just grabbing a water.
Yeah, you can't leave.
My name's Joe Betts. I'm a Villanova retiree from the philosophy department, retired in May 2011. Was here for 45 years before that and taught at Graterford 12 courses over 21 years between 1989 and my last course was in 2010. But one thing that you find interesting is that the first course I taught, they had no classrooms in the education wing, and so I taught it in the mosque. The mosque was under the chapel, and it was, you'd go down winding stairways through very dark halls before you got there. And of course, the mosques are pointed towards Mecca. So in modern building, you know, mosques might have their end in a corner because that's the direction of Mecca, not the wall. But at any rate, I'd go to the far wall with my shoes off and I'd teach. And occasionally, inmates who simply wanted to be in the mosque would come in while I was teaching a class in my socks, writing on a portable blackboard. And I was very much impressed by their devotion. As a Catholic, I'm used to Catholics who would go into a Catholic church in the late afternoon and pray before the Blessed Sacrament as if they're really in the presence of God. And I got that strong feeling when these guys would come in. They'd ignore me lecturing. They would do their bows, a way of praying, and you'd see guys, not infrequently, with calluses on their forehead from touching the ground as they prayed. But I was very impressed by that, and liked a lot of the guys that I knew were Muslims. I found out eventually that there were two different Muslim groups. One, I think, were Americanized Muslims. Were they followers of Malcolm X? That, or the larger group?
I should say that of the down in the chapel refers to a lot of things, but refers particularly to this world that used to exist that was shut down in 1995. The two main factions, which to some degree exist to this day, are those who at one time were in the Nation of Islam and followers of Elijah Muhammad. He died in 1975, and his son Wallace Warath-Din converted them. They converted en masse to Sunnism, but they retain a kind of activist, sociologically minded ethic. And the other group comes out, they emerge genealogically from what back in the day was called Orthodox Muslims, which is to say, at the time when the Nation of Islam controlled much of the imaginary for Americans with respect to Islam, they were Orthodox, and they moved further to the right, beginning in the 80s when African American men from the Mid-Atlantic started going over to Saudi to study and coming back, and they now primarily identify as Salafi, and they have in some sense won the culture war in Philadelphia, so that their mode of practice is the one that dominates. Anyway.
Well, at the time I was there, the group that came from the Nation of Islam had about 400 when I asked the question, and the other group only had about 40. And what was distinctive about the second group, the Salafis, as they are, was that it was important to them to learn Arabic and to read the Quran in Arabic. And they wanted Villanova to send in teachers of Arabic. Did we ever do that? Yeah. We did? Yeah. Okay. But that was very important to them. Eventually, the prison took the mosque out of the basement because I think there are so many corners and places to hide and do bad things that they brought it up and they built a little wing adjacent to the so-called Christian chapel. The Christian chapel, which has Catholic and Christian services, is one thing. The former choir loft has been converted into a synagogue for maybe 14, 15 Jews who were worshiping there. 5, down to 5, with Stan Rosenthal, principal of London.
Right.
But,
and worshiping.
okay.
But these are, which isn't to say that they're sitting there and like drinking coffee and arguing about things, most of them.
But the new mosque is
Jewish worship.
a very bare room adjacent to the chapel, and everything is very visible in it, and there's no corners to hide or anything, and a lot of light in it. If I may say one other thing, Josh asked, why do people want to teach there? And here's my reason. If you've read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, before that was written, I believed her main argument, you know, that blacks, especially in the United States, get a very, very bad deal. You know, when they were freed, they weren't given full freedom. Full freedom might have been more fully free if they were given each 40 acres and a mule. But when you take people out of slavery and say you're free, you're like the freedom that comes from being able to sleep under a bridge at night during the winter. That's the kind of freedom you have. Not the freedom that comes with a job, with prosperity, with a way of making a living. So that's why I wanted to start teaching there. And once I started teaching there, I really liked the guys. And this is interesting, but it was good for my ego or bad for my ego, because if I taught the same course to undergraduates at Villanova and to the guys in Gravery, I got much better course evaluations from the guys in Gravery. Now I say this is selfish and egoistic and what have you, but, and I don't blame the undergraduates at Villanova. If I tell them I'd love to be a member of a social democratic party in the United States, democratic socialism is what we should aim for, that's putting off people. Undergraduates would call me a communist or say I'm an American hater because I teach the ethics of war, in which all of the texts were critical of American wars. And I don't blame them for that. But one last thing, and I promise you I'll shut up. In teaching philosophy of criminal justice at Greater, for several years I used Helen Prejean's book, The Death of Innocents, I-N-N-O-C-E-N-T-S, meaning the death of innocent people. Her first book, Dead Man Walking, was about her counseling 2 men who were guilty, who weren't innocent, who died. Her second book, The Death of Innocents, was about her counseling 2 men who almost certainly were innocent, and our system put them to death. And I wanted them to see that a Catholic nun could be like this. I'm very Catholic in background culturally, and I'm a church-going Catholic. And I wanted them to see that this Catholic nun and a lot of other Catholics were on their side. Well, I had an interesting experience after I was teaching there. I'm meeting with the Lifers Club, and the thing that's dearest to the Lifers is that there's no longer automatic real life sentences, death by incarceration they call it, real life sentences. They want to get rid of that in Pennsylvania. And I'm talking to them and I get an idea. And the idea is this. Helen Prejean, the nun who wrote The Death of Innocents, did something very significant for the Catholic Church. She got the Vatican probably to change the Vatican Catechism so that the Catechism of the Catholic Church now opposes capital punishment. At any rate, she got this change and she's had a very big effect in the United States. So my idea is, hey, I'll write to her and I'll say to her, you've done a lot to change the death penalty into life imprisonment. Now do something to change real life imprisonment into 25-year terms or the equivalent of that. Please, please, you're a very influential person. The movie that you had made did a lot of good in the world. You can take another step. See, you've taken a step which has put in a lot of people who would have been put to death into life imprisonment, real life imprisonment. Take another step. Do something to get all these guys in Pennsylvania and 67 other states that have real life sentences, get them out of death by imprisonment. I even had a backup in this. Father David Cragen, who's the head of the theater department, staged Dead Man Walking Here. He staged it, I went to see it in St. Mary's Chapel. And as he was staging it, he said he was in contact with Helen Prejean about it. And she visited here, she visited him. And by the way, when she did visit him, I remember walking with her from the field house back to here and lending her my coat because it was cold in November, she didn't expect it. But at any rate, she doesn't know me personally, and she did not answer my letter, and I'm so disappointed in her, and it's unfair of me to do so. She's already done a lot of good, but if she had read my letter, and by the way, I published my letter in the Catholic Pacifist Group in Philadelphia's newsletter, Joe Bradley supervising a former Augustinian priest. But anyway, I'm so disappointed in her, but it showed me a failure of where a religious person could have helped people in Great Britain. Enough, I'm sorry it took so long.
That's all right. Good to hear from you.
So Joe, I'm sorry.
I'm going to talk, but it's probably going to be rambling because I've taught it at Greater for about 6 times over the years, and I've struggled with the questions that you've posed. I'm like, what's going on here? I don't know if I have an answer, but the first class that I taught there was oppression and liberation. And I was like, oh, this sounds like fun. This would be a good course, But then I got up there and I was like, oh my God, I'm in a classroom of 35 men who live this kind of oppression, And it just shocked me all of a sudden. Again, I was very naive going in there. And the men came up to me in the beginning of the class and they were like, don't worry, we have your back. And I'm like, why? Because I went through that orientation too, but I wasn't scared. I just, they gave me a whistle.
Yeah, I still have my whistle.
Yeah, I saw my whistle, but don't ever attempt to.
Yeah, no, I think
I
would be
did
a
that
bad
once. I pretended and they all panicked. Don't ever do that. That's not funny. So I was like, okay. But anyhow, I keep coming back to what is it? Because I felt the same things. I'm walking out there going, I feel closer to these men than some of my good friends. I don't know what it is. But the only thing you come up with is there's the pretenses of our identities are gone. And our humanity is just bare and open. So that it's that coming together of that two humanities in this unpretentious way. I don't even know what I'm saying, but trying to struggle with that it's just humanity to humanity.
How do you account for that?
I don't know. I've even done classes where I brought Villanova. I taught the same class at Villanova and taught the same class there. And then for 4 times we came together. And I had the same experience. It was like, for those 2 hours, it was a different reality.
Right.
It wasn't a prisoner and a professor. It wasn't a Villanova student and a prisoner. It was a person to a person.
So I
don't know if that makes
want to
sense.
I want to hear how precisely you think that happens, because something that I observe, and I would certainly put my experiences within this rubric, and in some way this was like it was more acute because I was there as first as an ethnographer, and when you're in the field as an ethnographer, it's kind of like the experience of life plus right? In the way that, because like your world is saturated with narrative and like the world is pregnant with significance because you're writing everything down, right? And that was all the more so in the prison, right? Because if you leave at the end of the day, whether it's with academic volunteers or whether it's with religious volunteers, there's some, like, the kind of, there's an acute intensity of being in that space that invariably engenders something that feels significant and transformative to those who come in from the outside, right? And so then what account do we give of that? So I try to make sense of it. So these courses mean so much to these men. The subject position of student that these men get to occupy when they're in that room is, I think, such a relief for them from the other kinds of subject positions they're forced to occupy.
Well, that they're able to be a human being in that classroom.
Mm.
They're not a number anymore.
Yeah, and I think it goes both ways. I think you had such an insight when you said there is something with the persona go off. It's our side as well.
Right.
I mean, you can go in there and pretend like, you know, you're professorial and you've got the authority of an institution, but it's something ridiculous. You end up feeling ridiculous if you try that.
Well, it's not gonna.
Right. And they
It's not transformative.
Right. And they don't have to, within that context, you know, have to play the usual roles they play out, you know, in the prison at large. So there is a kind of suspension of roles, at least for a time.
I don't dispute this account. I merely want to sociologize it, which is to say, how freaking weird that we have these institutions of mass incarceration where those of us who aren't incarcerated get to go to become human beings temporarily.
Exactly.
Like, how
Yeah.
freaking weird is that?
See, and I guess.
Because sorry, go ahead, Joyce.
I take it out of my own religious Christian context of the idea of, you know, God's plan of the reign of God, the kingdom of God, that we're all equal here. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is the only place I get to experience this.
Well, no, I mean, I just think there's something significant in the fact that it is constructed so that it is a place that you cannot take humanity for granted.
Right.
Right? I mean, that is how it is constructed. That is the logic of the
Absolutely.
place. Right? And so, because, the irony is that on the outside, we think we can take humanity for granted, but actually very few people are being very human.
Right.
And the inside, the whole point is that, it works by dehumanization. Like it can't exist otherwise. And so everything becomes laden with this sense of you're making a choice for or against your own humanity and the humanity of people around you. So this happened when my first time in prison was the year after college. I was actually very leery of prison ministry because that seemed like it was going to exploit and have this cheap faith, and I just wanted nothing to do with it. So some of my friends were involved in it. I just wanted to teach math, and because I love math, and so we're just trying to figure out positive and negative integers, and it is a human triumph. I try to create that in other math classrooms in the world, but the fact is that everything has this narrative underneath it, which is about this ultimacy of declaring your humanity or not. And that's what really is so absolutely compelling.
So can you flesh it out then? So is
Yeah.
it like, there's this kind of, we describe, my experience is same at the orientation where there's like this production of the non-human institutionally. So is your account that like, no, but humanity is, like there is a kind of a priori humanity, and so therefore the experience of going to the prison is to have that institutionalization, demonization fail? Is that the account you're giving? Like that it fails because at the end of the day, these are humans, or is there something, because that would strike me as a strong claim.
It doesn't fail nearly enough, but it can't, I don't know.
It doesn't win the day. It's not the end.
But there's a desire to, there's something else there besides what you're being told is there.
Right.
let me try a thought experiment. Okay. How many of you all have taught at Graderford? Is just okay. Here's the thought experiment. And if my students on the outside brought it the way that my students at Graderford brought it, I would feel similarly uplifted by being in the classroom on the outside. True or false? Honestly.
True.
True. All of us say true.
True.
All of us say true. You're not a little bit skeptical of the kind of like the fairy dust that comes with the cinematic element and the kind of the place apart and that kind of like the way that this space of separation engenders a kind of specialness. You're willing to.
The fairy dust is all over the place. It's not just in the prison.
So you think that like so it's the intensity because I'm tempted to go along with this that the experience of the amazing encounter comes from that like the experience mostly in the classroom is like you bring this like earnest, overly enthusiastic vulnerability and one or two students like meets you in intensity and like you love them for it, but ultimately you end up feeling a little bit of shame for having like let it hang out, you know, and like there it's like it's actually you get more than you give, right?
Yeah.
It's a bit utopian this account, but yeah.
But I think I would argue to say that there's only the chance for that fairy dust to occur in like a very small amount of classes. Like, how do you bring that into like intro to biology or like an upper level chemistry class? Like, there really isn't room for that same sort of debate. So, how do you bring your humanity into like a hard science rather than something like a criminal justice class where you have the chance to debate humanity and debate theology and to talk about these human experiences?
The molecular biologist will now speak.
Claim was math.
Yeah, the kid was.
No, she's got all kinds of science
biologist.
degrees.
That's why
really.
I mentioned we didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, I come from like the hard sciences in my
Right.
undergraduate experience also, and I took a minor in peace and justice for the exact reason that like I don't have that, I don't know, that same sort of connection with my chemistry professors that I
Yeah.
have with someone who teaches ethics or theology or something else that is like a more human experience.
See, I don't think that I don't think it needs to be explicit. I mean, this is why. I mean, so I'm a theologian now, but I was a molecular biologist, and for the same reasons, because I mean the pursuit of trying. I mean, how in the world does one cell become this human being? I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. So there's enough wonder and in the pursuit of this mysterious truth. It's just as mysterious in the sciences as it. I mean, it's when we pretend that it's not mysterious that I think we lose it. The mysterious science is just and math. It's just as mysterious and amazing as some of the arts and the humanities. I mean, and it just knowledge, truth. I mean, so I think it's all I like Thomas Aquinas, and I mean that if it's truth, then it's revelatory, right? And that's regardless of the methodology in my mind. So to me, it's all possible.
This is kind of what I was going for in that passage. But so like you're saying that like pedagogy is a devotional practice, right?
Yeah. And frankly, I mean, like, so I taught at a school for at-risk youth. Whatever. Every kid had different stories, and we lived in community. There were about 80 students. It was not a prison at all. They were all there by choice. It was not somewhere you'd be sent. And you were given the freedom to deeply love these students, right? And to be in relationship with them, and for them to love you back. And there's something about the intensity and the magnificence of that teaching experience that also tracks to my teaching experiences in prison. Because, I mean, there is this freedom of this authentic relationship that is allowed to, use the word love, right? I mean, that's a sort of scary word.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
So, so certainly, I can imagine a hard line opposition to mass incarceration that would look at these pleasures we're describing as like filthy pleasures and say like, how dare you take those pleasures? I'm not of that position. So like there's this population who we have the opportunity to teach and to have these kinds of experiences that are for us extraordinary and that for them might do something in the way that the extraordinary experiences we have as teachers engender some kind of a complementary experience for our students. But is it doing anything politically? Like you have, are we doing something? You have this, it seems like you have an itch. Your itch is that it's not, that it's insufficient or.
Well, I mean, I have, Catherine, your sense that, you know, to get to the point where you know, humanization comes in, it's not necessarily a discourse that's explicit about the ethics of humanity. It's actually all the normal defensiveness, anxieties, and guards go down for long enough that you can enter into an adventure with other people about a destination of the good that neither of you really have marketed, understood, mastered ahead of time. And Joyce, one of the things you said, this really struck me the first day I was at Greater Bird. And I'm sure I looked like a deer in headlights. And Andre Davis came over to me and basically said, similar, I think he might have used those words, you know, I have your back, we have your back. And of course what it was is, you know, I know you do, basically it was like, I know you don't know what you're doing. We don't know what we're doing either. You know, you can trust this space for whatever can happen to happen. And, you know, I think, you know, what you were saying about the sciences, I think is really important about sort of, I said kind of without thinking as much through, but now I'm willing to say there's something more to it, that if we want to understand the crisis of the humanities, which is not just a crisis of the humanities, it's a crisis of education per se, and it's actually a crisis of politics, right? We're actually, it's a crisis of our politics itself, that really, the obsession with work, I mean, look, the nice part of it is you want people to have some self-determination in their lives, but the work we're talking about is not, it's not a spirited notion of work. And as this becomes more and more, the resemblance between life inside a prison and life outside the prison is not as, it's closer than I think we would be comfortable about. As far as the politics goes, I mean, of course, you know, look, I've watched enough movies, I would just like the institution to disappear, right? But I think one political aspect, I don't know ultimately the significance, but I think it's important, is you're in that classroom with men who have been told that they don't matter. That the best they can do is plug in some BS demoralizing job that pays nothing. And it's going to be reinforced to them, it's even going to be hard, that mainly they'll probably have to be in prison to get that lousy job. You know, right? And actually what happens, it's nothing you do as a teacher. What happens is over the course of a term or several terms, you realize what's happening is those same men are themselves becoming teachers. That is a whopping contradiction in our politics. If it got out, it would be harder to sustain a lot of the institutional ideology that makes, frankly, American education so demoralizing. And I think it's continuing on that path. And it's not, I'd like to, you know, what I really want is for the walls of those prisons to be more porous. And it's, again, it's not just to help the men inside. I never really went in with the idea I was helping them. It's more like, you know, we need, as a culture, for whom this wall actually is a disease, we need to understand what the disease is, all of us on both sides of the wall. So that's the sense in which it's become, you know, much more political for me, and not in the stupid notion of politics we often talk about, in this deeper philosophical notion of really what it means to constitute a community. So that's the sense in which that's my itch.
Dan.
Hi, Professor.
Dan.
Been a while since I heard that. So I'm a relatively recent member of the Villanova community. I've only been here about 7 months. But one thing I've noticed, and I don't want to demean any undergraduates in the room, but a lot of the undergraduates here seem to be here purely for getting a job afterwards, which isn't a bad thing. We said we want self-determination. But when I went to the career fair a couple weeks back, and I just walked around, and I looked at the kind of people who were here recruiting, almost entirely finance, military industry, things of that sort. Not a lot of go out and do things for the public good. Now, I'm not saying that people aren't recruited from here for Teach for America and service projects, but I did notice they really weren't represented at all. I think there was only one booth for teaching.
They have a different.
Oh, they have a different one. Okay, okay, well, that kind of takes away the point of my comment, because I was really like scared for the future of humanity after seeing that. But what it made me think about was the need to articulate more than just getting a job, and the need to inculcate, it's not just citizenship, it's the appreciation that there's more to a university. A university can do more than just get you a job. It can preserve the arts, it can preserve culture, it can have a civic project, which seems to be what you're talking about in the prison. And you know, a lot of the people who go to this school and a lot of other ones of this kind are extremely privileged. They've never needed to question. They've never had the arts taken away from them. They never had the humanity taken away from them, so they've never needed to question its value. The sad thing is you have to go to an extreme situation to find people who actually do appreciate that. So, which then becomes a cultural question, because like I don't want to you can't send the whole population to prison. You wouldn't want to. You wouldn't want to make the country live through a despotic regime where it would feel like we're all living in a prison. But I do wonder, what is it going to take to make people think differently about what a university can do, what it should do in relation to displaced peoples? And there's no easy answer there.
Well, it's not merely the relation to displaced peoples, it's the relation to those values other than work and making a living. I mean, this is...
Which is important, but it's not the only
Yeah,
thing.
no, yeah. Yeah, no, that's why there's an old ancient Greek proverb, you know, don't be like the fool and have to learn from your own suffering, only from your own suffering. And I mean, you know, that there are models of education that really have to do with beauty, and there are models that have to do with finding meaning in suffering. And you don't want to set up where the culture is, seems to be choosing that it's going to take all its lessons from suffering.
Those of you who are here, I mean, so I think thus far we've only heard from people who taught in the program, but that shouldn't be a prerequisite for speech at all. Presumably you're here because you're interested in social justice, or in teaching, or in prisons, or...
I find it a little frustrating that, we're almost only focusing on the internal aspect of what's going on inside the prison walls and that system. And I guess just to frame it myself, I'm currently a master's student in the counseling department. I'm counseling I'm a clinical therapist at a place called St. Gabriel's Hall, working with juvenile delinquents. And I mean, it's obviously been really difficult, and I can relate to all this. I've tutored in prison for 2.5 years now. I went to Princeton myself and worked with the PD Green program. And just thinking about, the system outside of the walls, and I can just draw from one instance where I was talking with a kid, and his family was supposed to come in, and we were supposed to have a family session that day, and his mom couldn't come in because she had just been in court that day because her oldest son had just been sentenced to, and it was a short term, but 4 years at Greaterford. I was talking with the younger brother who the family was supposed to be with, and I said, well, how are you feeling about this? Like, what's going on in your mind? He said, at least I know my brother's safe now. It's not really, we're talking about how terrible it is to put these people in there, but sometimes we're saving them.
I mean, furthermore, you'll hear a lot of men talk like this in the chapel, right? And because often when they're, especially evangelicals, when they testify, and you realize who their peer group is, right? As these men who are in their 50s and 60s and are alive in the chapel, and everyone that they used to run with on the outside is dead. Similarly, the kinds of, this is an old trope, but it's true, the kind of opportunity to reflect on life and to pursue the good life that, whether it be in the chapel or in a way that lines up more with the kinds of practices that I'm indigenous to, the Villanova program, that the men that are at Greaterford have opportunities unlike the opportunities that their counterparts on the street would have for exploration, for spiritual growth, for edification, right? In some sense, because they're partially freed from the demand. I mean, these men work jobs. They need money. You need to work a full-time job just to be able to call your sweetheart on the phone because of the exploitative telephone contracts.
Right.
But they are, to some extent, they're not paying mortgages. They are in these structures in which they are able, that it is one kind of little strange, between moving back and forth between graduate school and the prison when I was doing my research. These are two strange backwaters where everything is not utilitarian, where there are kind of structures to explore the nature of the good.
Mhm.
So that's a smaller, it's like a small perversity, that calls attention to the broader kinds of broken social structures of which the prison is but a small part. And maybe from you I'm hearing that it's a small part that it gets too much attention relative to these other things, that it's easy to give it attention relative to these other things. What's your intuition?
Say that one more time.
Are you thinking you just wanted to add into the conversation the idea that these kinds of injustices and this kind of systemic suffering is in no way limited to the prison? That
Yeah.
it's
I have one quick thing. I really share your frustration, and I love and very grateful to the Villanova Gradebook program, but we don't do much as a university about the connection to the neighborhoods and what happens before and after prison. And there's a weird reification of the prison, and of course the danger of really linking education essentially to that environment. And I mean education really in both ways, but the real realization is the perverse economy that is it's a very few neighborhoods in Philadelphia that supply just an extraordinary amount of the population of Greater Perth. And it's in a circuit. It's not just isolated. And I think part of my political uneasiness is precisely, the problem of focusing just on what happens in the prison, as important as that is.
I'd like to speak to this gentleman. I taught here for 45 years, and for at least the last 20, in every course that I possibly could, I had my students read the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was important, of course, because the UN was founded in 1945 as the war ended, and that took care of relations between nations. But there was a need for something like a new morality. What are people like? What are their needs? What are their rights? It's not the same thing as a full-fledged morality, but Eleanor Roosevelt and the UN worked out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you read it, the first 21 support democracy. But from 22 to 29, they support socialism. And in part because Russia was one of those nations working this out, and the Russians and Eastern Europeans wouldn't let us get away with just supporting democracy. Okay, what happened in the United States to 22 through 29? The right to health care, the right to an education, the right to a job, the right to food, clothing, and so forth, paid vacations. What happened to them? Well, the typical Republican says it's a wish list. They're ideals, they're not rights. Wouldn't it be wonderful if people could have them, but our capitalistic economy doesn't generate them automatically? Well, at any rate, I became convinced that we are a deficient nation, our economy isn't good enough, because it doesn't guarantee those material human rights, they're called, as opposed to formal human rights. In the formal human right, you say to the government, don't touch me, keep away from me, leave me alone. In the material human rights, typically you have to say to the government, help me. Help me because I'm sick and I don't have the money to go to a doctor. Help me because I can't give a complete education to my kids. Help me because there's no jobs out there. So when I said I was already convinced of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and its bad treatment of blacks, it's because 2/3 of Graterford are black people. 2/3 of them live in these terrible neighborhoods. When the blacks moved in, the factories moved out. Go to St. Francis Inn sometime, those of you that are around here, and you'll find around St. Francis Inn very big factory buildings that are empty. They're empty because when the blacks moved up from the south, there was a transition period where there were some jobs for them. Now all those factories are empty, and that's one of the main areas, Tom
Schill?
Tom Schilk comes from Kensington, from that area. It's one of the worst parts of the city now. Capitalism doesn't work the way it should. We need to regulate it or change it or do something, but we're deficient in that.
Joyce, did you want to say something? Other sorts of questions or concerns?
Josh, could we ask Joyce about, she has done art with them. To what extent is the art religious that they have done for you, Joyce?
Let me think. Explicitly religious, there's few,
Okay,
but definitely, I think implicit
okay.
in their artwork.
Mhm.
Well, one thing that one would say is the comment you made about that the inmates are going out and teaching others, kind of thing. There's a group, I don't know if you know, the Restorative Justice Group. They're doing amazing work. It came out of a class that I taught, and now they're doing these workshops, and I was at a workshop 2 weekends ago. But these men are doing amazing work, and I really wish somehow Villanova could get reconnected to them, because Haverford has taken that over, so to speak. But they do first level workshops, second level workshops, mini workshops, because what the men have noticed themselves is that these parole violators are coming in. They're only there for 3 to 6 months, so they can't do the whole course. They do this mini workshop for 3 days. But they need to get that published somehow, or get that out there. And the big question around that is, why is it successful when it's done by the men in prison? It's very similar to the question I think you were asking. What is it that makes this experience what it is? So, I mean, I don't know what we can do, or if there is anything we can do to support that. But they're doing amazing work there.
I was just going to go back to Jim's question about what are we called to do in this environment, and I was listening to what you felt called to do in terms of the relationship with these men. And I often ask the students who go in, because I link up students with a tutoring program, GED and literacy. And I often ask the students, and we talk about the degree program, I often ask them, I don't need you to answer this for me, but I need you to think about what in your mind makes these men deserving of the college education that you work so hard to get. You know, you've studied in high school, you're taking out loans, your parents are paying $57,000 a year. What makes this the right thing to do? And then I think, Jim, you raise another question about, while in doing it, for whatever reason we're doing it, what are we called to do in that doing it? And I'm not sure what I hear is how stunned we are, or how voyeuristic it is to be in this sort of different environment. I'm not sure we know why we do what we do, and if we're not asking those questions, how can we answer what we're called to be doing? So I guess I would like to see those people who teach or engage enter more thoroughly into that conversation And then secondarily to that, what is needed by those people, and how can we respond?
Yeah.
So I think we do it, but we're not asking those questions, like the restorative justice program. What better way for us to be engaged? But I think it's important, where do we go from here, is
Yeah.
to keep at it.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point, and this is part of what Josh is doing in Montreal in May, is to begin to have conversations with people who, you put it perfectly, Nori. My experience is that I had certain kind of low level, I'm going to do these set of courses. The question of what I am called to do happened from within that context. And I don't think it's necessarily an answer that, I think it's fine for individuals to come up with it, but I think more it's a calling that's better served by the self-consciousness of a community, right? Which actually in some ways is already in place, it's just the articulation's not quite conscious. And I think, I think much more can be done. Yeah, there's lots of things that are happening in Villanova that don't necessarily get coordinated in ways that I think frame the question of education in a less panicky way that the normal sort of, economic worries, are going to incline an institution to frame the question. So I think that's really an important point, is to be able to try to find, realize who's already in your community, and then how you can begin to expand that.
Because these men have done some bad things.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be low level, but they've done some really bad things. And that needs to be in the mix.
Yeah.
As we deal with the wonderment of their curiosity and their self-selecting nature of wanting more from life, or wanting to give to the community of prison. But and I don't want to say despite that, because that's a very bad way of putting it, that with that,
Mm-hmm.
with them, in what they have been by nature or nurture entered into, that love needs to be there.
Yeah.
And how that love gets sort of put into them is by virtue of what we have, knowledge, education, privilege.
You don't feel that the terrible things that many of them have done aren't like already in the mix to a tremendous degree, in as much as you just use the phrase in the mix to bring that
in the mix
into
of how we feel about what we're doing and how we feel about them. Because we can't forget, I don't want the students to forget, in a way, that these are people who, if you weren't in this environment and weren't loving them in this moment, these are the same people you meet out there, and you have to sort of come to some philosophical, what does doing bad things mean, or where does it come from, and what neighborhoods does it come from? Sorry.
But also, does doing bad things define you for the rest of your life?
Those are the questions,
Yeah, it's just-
Right.
And
Does the legal system give a appropriate boundary between the people who do bad things and the people who don't do bad things?
But there's the questions that arise from acknowledging that they're
Yeah.
innocent,
Yeah,
in a
they're
sense.
critical
There's just a
questions.
ton of political questions,
one of the things, I feel like we've ridden ideology critique far enough, but, these are, especially when we're talking with students, creating the conditions through social theory to encourage people to reflect on the conditions of their own existence and to think about the systems that they are always already implicated in seems like one of the things, based on my training, that I have to offer. But to model that, it's amazing how long that I've cared about this before I suddenly realized that thinking about this question of what do I need to do that would be politically sufficient to the task at hand, and that framing that at the level of the individual, that the spirit of neoliberalism was speaking through me. It might also be the spirit of Platonism or Christianity or whatever it is, but it is like to think of this as a problem that the individual in some way that an individual response can be commensurate is radically insufficient. And so it was only, and it took me like 10 years to suddenly figure that out, and it was because I started hanging out and organizing with this group, Decarcerate PA. You all should Google them. These are folks based in Center City that started like 3 years ago. It's a coalition of over 100 organizations, but there's a core constituency. They're now operating all over the state, and they are working to decarcerate Pennsylvania. Right? They have a 3-point platform: no new prisons, decarceration, and then community reinvestment. Based on my own interest, I know that one thing that people in this room might have to offer that is that it, in my experience of it, in my experience of this group is a little bit out of date, but they're very, they're disproportionately like young, urban, cosmopolitan seculars. So it would be great if they need to have more kind of people of faith organizing with them if they're going to, if we're going to win. So that's one place to think about, coupling your own agency into an institution to maximize our effectivity. The other thing is then to think about the institutions you're a part of and figure out ways to get those institutions more on the hook. So with that regard, are you guys I love this program. I love the Villanova program. I feel a tremendous debt to it. Are you guys satisfied with the level of institutional investment in the program? What when we talk about wanting to see more, whether it be vis-a-vis restorative justice program, how would you like to see Villanova? What would you like to see Villanova go?
Well, we're getting a full-time director. That's a big deal.
Oh, we are?
Yeah. And
That is a big deal.
And I made no secret of the fact I think we have to do more with when our students get out of Greater Group. Right now, it's very restrictive for what basically the on-campus program is shut down.
The course I did with was on campus, and
Right.
That was great. But those days are gone.
So I mean, some way maybe to reopen the conversation. I think would be.
Maybe once the director gets in, to reopen that conversation with the superintendent, to maybe bring some faculty out there or something,
Josh, for a while, some of us were hopeful that a Masters of Liberal Studies program would be offered out there. And it even looked like we had the president's endorsement. It was very iffy. It disappeared, but they would love that.
Yeah, I think.
I wanted to say about this, some of them did terrible things. This is a narrow Catholic example. But St. Maria Goretti, there's a St. Maria Goretti High School in Philadelphia. In fact, it's Goretti Newman, South Philly, was killed when she was 13 or 14 by a rapist who, to rape her, had to murder her. And if I'm not mistaken, after serving the Italian equivalent of a life sentence, he became a priest. And he went around talking about the saintliness of Maria Goretti. Do I have that right? It's some famous Catholic girl who became a saint, whose murderer became kind of a celebrity in a religious sense. But it makes you think about terrible people doing terrible things and it not defining their whole life. Incidentally, that reminds me of the woman who was to be put to death last week.
Yeah.
Who's the...
She's a divinity student.
Yeah, of who? In Tübingen. Who's at Tübingen that came to visit her?
Moltmann?
Moltmann. Yeah, Jürgen Moltmann became a buddy of hers. He's a very big thing in theology.
Yeah,
And the
yeah,
same
he's still
thing
working.
happened with a woman that George Bush, as governor of Texas, put to death. She became very religious. And in her case, it was the leaders of the Southern Baptist movement who were convinced that this woman is one of the best Christians we know. And Billy Graham types went to bat trying to keep her alive. And George Bush, of course, would have none of it. But people do change in prison. Their initial acts might be really bad, but that's not the whole person.
I think at this point I want to thank you all for coming and thank Josh for facilitating this great conversation. And please get some food on the way out if the spirit moves.
If the body.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Thank you.